Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait a couple more seconds as people are jumping on before we go ahead and get started. Okay, today's webinar is on the subject of RIOS 2016. We'll be going over some of the main changes to the standard, which some of you may already be familiar with. We have some clients who have already transitioned or are in the process of transitioning. We have some clients who will be transitioning in the future over the next year or two. And then we have some clients who potentially are being certified for the first time. So they're being audited to RIOS 2016 right off the bat. So depending on where you fall in that, you may pull different information from this webinar, but we'll be focusing really on the changes between 2006 and 2016 versions of the RIOS standard today. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. We have a brief agenda here just to give you a general idea of what we'll be covering. We'll talk a little bit about PJR and what we offer, some benefits to certification, timelines for transition for clients who will be transitioning from the 2006 version to the 2016 version of the standard. We'll focus most of our time on the clause-by-clause overview, first talking about some of the key changes at a high level, and then going into a bit more detail on a clause-by-clause review. And at the end, we'll close with an overview of the certification process for anyone who is not familiar with how that works, and we'll leave time for questions. You can see on the GoToWebinar bar, there's a section where you can type your questions in. Feel free to do that at any time. I will save them for the end, but like I said, feel free to type them in at any time and we'll take a look at those at the end of the presentation. PJR is one of the leading registrars in the world, and this is a list of some of the countries where we currently offer certifications to a variety of standards. It's not an all-inclusive list, but it gives you an idea of our range of coverage. And we have a list here of the various standards to which we are accredited to grant certification. Of course, RIOS is on this list, and that's what we'll be talking about today. The benefits of certification vary by client, or everyone's situation is a little bit different, but in general, when we're talking about RIOS specifically, we see improvements in the QEHNS performance of the organization, QEHNS standing for Quality, Environmental, Health, and Safety, since RIOS incorporates all of those requirements, and helps those organizations not only improve their performance, but also minimize their risks by identifying and controlling the risks. They are effectively lowering those risks. Certification to RIOS helps in meeting legal requirements. Again, going through the process of identifying what they are and putting controls in place makes it more likely for the organization that they'll be able to maintain compliance. RIOS addresses sourcing and outsourcing controls, which can have a variety of positive effects on an organization. There is a positive impact on management commitment and employee engagement that we often see go hand in hand with certification to these standards by going through the exercise of implementing and maintaining the standards requirements. Having certifications in various industries can often provide a competitive advantage or improve the organization's public image, especially if competitors do not also hold that same certification. There can be potential financial benefits. For example, if you are at a competitive advantage over your competitors by holding a certification, you may get contracts for that reason. In addition to legal requirements, it can help create a framework for meeting customer requirements as well, which improves your customer satisfaction ratings, your quality metrics. There could be a lot of positive impacts there. And obviously, a commitment to responsibly recycling goes hand in hand with RIOS as well. The transition deadline is September 30th, 2019. And keep in mind that the audit, not only does your audit need to take place by this deadline, but also the entire certification process, any certification decisions need to be completed by this deadline. So what this means is you're not going to be able to wait until mid-September to have your audit without having a lapse in certification, because there's still a lot that happens after your audit takes place. Any nonconformities identified during the audit need to be resolved through the corrective action process, which, depending on the grading of the findings, could take longer. If you have a major, you have to fully implement it and provide objective evidence, so that can take a bit longer sometimes. And we also have our internal processes for reviewing all the audit packages and sending samples of the certificates to the client to approve before we can actually issue that certificate. So just something to keep in mind, that all of those activities need to be completed and a certificate issued before that deadline. Otherwise, your previous version of your certificate will expire before you have a new one in your hand, which is what we call a lapse in certification. And during that period, you're not technically certified and are not allowed to advertise certification in any way. Another important note about transition audits for the RIOS 2016 transition is that the ISRI transition plan dictates transitions must take place during a recertification audit. So what that means is, if you're due for a recertification this year, for example, but you're not ready to transition, next year's audit, which may even need to occur earlier than usual to meet the deadline we just talked about, will also be made into a recertification audit, meaning the audit length will increase, which is an increase in costs. So something to think about when you're planning when you will be ready to transition. You want to keep in mind that if it's not a regularly scheduled recertification audit, it will be lengthened to that of a recertification audit, and the costs will reflect that. And again, that's something that was dictated by the ISRI transition plan to make sure, as I understand it, that all of the processes are audited and there's sufficient time to cover all of the changes to the standard. The standard was revised for several reasons, as many of the standards have been revised of late. I'm not really going to spend time on this topic. The slides and the recording will be made available sometime after the presentation concludes. Feel free to read through this on your own if you're curious about the multitude of reasons why the standard was revised. Okay, so at a high level, the key changes in RIOS 2016 are an emphasis on leadership, focusing on a proactive approach to risk management, an emphasis on the outcomes of the management system, increased requirements for communication and awareness, including taking into account stakeholder and customer requirements on that subject, and change management expectations. There are also some key term changes, and again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on these items. I want to get to the clause by clause overview and make sure we have plenty of time, but if I've listed terms in the presentation, it's because either it's a new term or the definition has been revised to some extent. So definitely take a look at that when you get a chance, or review it if you have any questions related to things we talk about later. Customer versus supplier is a very important distinction in RIOS, and we'll talk more about that. And senior management is an important term as well, since we are since the revised standard puts more emphasis on leadership. In lieu of the term interested party, you'll see stakeholders here. Those are the biggest changes. So like I said, feel free to review those in the slides or the recording or within the standard itself if you have any questions about the changes there. So we'll go through clause by clause, highlighting really just the changes. I don't have every clause listed here if there wasn't significant change. Keep in mind too that the notes in the actual standard, if you're looking at the standard itself, there are notes throughout the document. Those provide guidance, but are not auditable. So as an auditor, we won't be able to write a finding against a note, is what that means. So looking at the first clause, scope and application, it's important to consider outside providers in the scope. So actions or activities performed by outside providers, such as contractors, need to be included in the scope, the footprint. Just because you're not doing work physically yourself, if it's under your control, if it's something that you're outsourcing, it's still relevant to your process as a whole, and your controls are likely trickling down to cover that process to some extent, or your specifications as if you were doing that yourself. So it is relevant to the scope of the RIOS management system, something to keep in mind. RIOS outcomes is an entirely new section. Again, one of the biggest changes is focusing on the outcomes of the system or the intended outcomes and a call for proactivity versus reactivity or reacting to things that have occurred. If you can proactively identify risk before an incident has occurred and put controls in place to prevent it, you're really being proactive instead of reacting to an injury, an accident, a near miss, something along those lines. And like I said, that's one of the main themes of the RIOS 2016 standard. There are requirements for assigning responsibilities, but in the new standard, senior management is really emphasized as far as accountability and involvement go to ensure adequate resources are provided and the intended outcomes of the management system can be met. So the emphasis is less on a management representative in and of itself. If it's one person, if it's a team, you know, whatever works best for the organization, but senior management ultimately needs to be held accountable, needs to be involved, needs to be aware of what's going on in the company and the management system specifically, how the organization is meeting the requirements of its QEHSMS, and whether or not it's meeting its intended outcomes. If anyone is familiar with ISO 14001:2015, for example, which we're just wrapping up the transition process for, the document control changes in RIOS 2016 are very similar. It's aligned pretty closely with the expectations and the changes to that standard, among others, to give greater flexibility in what types of documentation or media a company might be using as technology continues to change. There's some additional requirements related to what the policy needs to include, so take note of that as well. In clause 3, we talk about RIOS footprint, and again, you'll hear this quite a bit. Sorry if I sound like a broken record, but proactive planning is a theme in the standard. We're looking for greater proactivity, again, to not be reacting to issues that might be going on versus reacting to an incident that has occurred. Also keep in mind that the RIOS footprint can include positive impacts and doesn't need to focus solely on negative impacts. If you have positive impacts that are relevant, be sure to include that in your footprint as well. Important quality risks is a new section requiring the identification and control of risks related to product or service quality. So again, this is a proactive approach, trying to identify where else risk may exist, and risk being the effect of uncertainty, and again, can be positive or negative. So some examples you might consider include employee theft, ineffective training, departure of a key employee. This can have a significant effect on an organization. Someone who's been in their role for a long time maybe doesn't have time to overlap with the next person taking on their role, or maybe didn't always have everything documented as clearly as could be related to how they do their job or the processes that they complete. Equipment or tool breakdown can have a big impact as well. So again, a proactive approach to quality risks is a new requirement. Environmental impacts and health and safety risks have been added to in the new standard. There's some additional requirements, including documentation of rating criteria and controls, respectively. So you'll want to take a look at those sections and see what's new there. Legal requirements can include product requirements, and again, the controls need to be documented. Those are the primary changes there. Product, service, and customer requirements is a new section as well. It requires the documentation of requirements for products, services, and customers, and what methods will be used to monitor how the organization is meeting those requirements. That might be relevant to products, customer requirements, outsourced activities, again, like we mentioned earlier, source material specifications and controls. That's not an all-inclusive list, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. And it also requires verification and records of conformity. So we're looking for records as evidence of completing all the requirements in this clause, and verification that the controls and the monitoring methods are effective, that the organization is effectively meeting those customer requirements. Similarly, the next clause talks about stakeholder requirements, which would be other types of stakeholders beyond what was discussed in the previous clause. And again, it's a new section identifying who the stakeholders are and what their respective requirements might be, how they'll be controlled, reviewing that on an annual basis. And we went through those key definition changes, so take a close look at the stakeholder definition to understand who needs to be considered in there. Maybe some groups of individuals that you hadn't been considering before. You know, what requirements do you have to your landlord, perhaps, or your insurance company? Maybe some stakeholders that are often overlooked. Clause 3.2 talks about improvement planning. There are several inputs or items to be considered when establishing the organization's goals. Plans for goal achievement. We need a written plan identifying the specific tasks, who is assigned to those tasks, when those tasks are due, if any resource needs are required, and how those goals will be evaluated for effectiveness, or how you will know as an organization whether or not you have met that goal. I mentioned that change management is also one of the significant changes to the standard. This is an entirely new section. It was implied in previous versions of the standard, among other standards. However, now it's required very clearly to have a written plan to review the QEH-SMS and the RIOS footprint for changes prior to implementing whatever it is you're thinking about implementing, bringing in a new piece of equipment, adding a new process, relocating, whatever the case may be, whatever change you're looking to make, reviewing what changes this may cause, what impact it could have from a quality standpoint, an environmental standpoint, a health and safety standpoint, before the change is made, again, thinking along the lines of proactivity, instead of just reacting to the change and making the changes in the documented system as necessary after the fact. Clause 4 talks about implementation, and we discussed earlier that there were some changes or additions to the competency and awareness requirements. So RIOS 2016 requires the identification of competency requirements. It's always been required to have records as evidence for the requirements within the standard. So we'll be looking for records as evidence of competence and how effectiveness was verified or how competency was verified. There are some training considerations added to RIOS 2016, so take a look at that section. And again, the focus is on the intended outcomes of the QEH SMS. So certain roles, certain job titles, or certain processes within the facility may have less or more of an impact on those intended outcomes, and that can be relevant as well as far as what competencies or trainings might be required. Similarly, there's some additional requirements or topics to consider in relation to awareness. And communication, this clause now requires a documented communication plan or plans. The standard goes on to break down the different types of communication between customers, suppliers, outside suppliers. Again, you can check your definitions for clarification on these terms. Other types of external communication. Outside supplier refers to contractors. Some of the language has been changed in this section, besides just changing the name. And the standard specifies some required communication when it comes to visitors, stakeholders, different groups like that. And I've listed some examples that may be relevant to your facility. In terms of operational controls, we see a restructuring of the source materials section, previously suppliers, some clarified requirements, and expanded controls. So again, we're being more proactive here when we're talking about RIOS 2016 and what those expectations are. Outside providers was previously the contractors section and has some additional requirements similar to purchasing controls. And again, with a focus on quality controls, this is a new section, requires documentation of what the specifications are, what the requirements are, any worker instructions, things like that. The new standard breaks down quality controls versus environmental and health and safety controls and gives each its own section. To really clearly document what is required. So we see, again, new requirements to document controls, or clarified requirements to document controls, I should say. There are no significant changes to the emergency preparedness requirements, except that when we talk about external communication, it's more clearly communicated in the standard, the need to communicate emergency preparedness requirements to stakeholders, visitors, whoever may be relevant. Clause 5 talks about checking and corrective actions. There are some additional considerations for a monitoring and measurement process. There is a clear annual evaluation requirement added to RIOS 2016 when it comes to legal and other requirements and the compliance of the QEHSMS in meeting those requirements. And there is additional verbiage about who would be considered competent to conduct those legal and other compliance evaluations. So take a close look at that and make sure whoever is currently conducting those compliance reviews within your organization is competent against this verbiage or definition. And if not, look into either obtaining the competencies for that individual or seeking other help with that compliance review. There are some additional requirements related to maintenance and calibration, mostly documentation of requirements, follow up when something is out of tolerance. So making sure that those actions are documented to show the actions taken. Monitoring and measuring is to be an input into the management review. And we have a new section, EHS incident investigations, which requires investigation for all EHS incidents. And this is important because there is a definition within the standard for what an incident is, what that represents. So sometimes we see a disparity between what the standard considers an incident and what an organization might consider an incident. And the result is that we may not necessarily see, come audit time, records of an investigation for incidents that have occurred that we should see them for. So take a close look at that definition in the standard. As an example, it includes near misses, and this is a common one for organizations to overlook. When it comes to investigation, it's easy to say, you know, nothing was damaged, no one got hurt, there's no need to investigate this. But the standard says otherwise, that is considered an incident and should be investigated according to the requirements in the standard. Another change here from an audit perspective, you may recall during your audits, we're looking at NCRs, we call them PNCRs, previous NCRs. So we're looking at the audits from the NCRs from the last audit. So if you had, let's say 2 minors at your last audit, somewhere in the course of this year's audit, we would be reviewing the correction, the corrective action that you had reported, whether those were actually implemented and whether it was effective in addressing the nonconformity. So we'd be looking for evidence that that issue no longer exists before we verified and closed that out. So that's a common practice, that's not new. But what is different with RIOS 2016 is that now we will be looking at the past 2 years worth of previous NCRs to really get a sense of the effectiveness of the corrective actions taken, the root, was the root cause really appropriate? Because after 2 years, we haven't seen another similar issue, or are we seeing some repeat findings and some themes there that could be relevant? So that will be a difference in your audits as well. Internal audits are annual, that's not new. Full system evaluations prior to certification or recertification. So what that verbiage is relating to is make sure that your annual audits occur before our third-party audits, like the ones PJR conducts, to verify you're continuing to meet the RIOS requirements, because that is relevant to our audit. We're going to be taking a close look at the outputs of your internal audit, how that process went, similarly to the management review. So really, ideally, this would be scheduled and completed prior to our audits. Otherwise, we don't have anything new since the last audit necessarily to look at, and we're not maybe getting a sense of that process. And internal audits are a process or a supporting process that we will audit every year. So that's something to keep in mind when scheduling your internal audits. Especially if you are transitioning, we're also going to be looking for an internal audit to the new standard. And if you have not completed the internal audit to the new standard in its entirety, that would be a major nonconformity at your transition audit, because we need to see objective evidence of that having been completed prior to issuing you a RIOS 2016 certificate. So that's also something to keep in mind. And it can be challenging sometimes to conduct and complete the internal audit if you haven't already done so within the corrective action response timeframe that you're given. There are also some additional requirements for what the internal audit documented plan needs to detail. And there is some additional clarification provided for inputs and outputs required in the management review. I don't think anything is really new, but the verbiage might be a little bit different, trying to clarify what they're looking for in that section. Okay, so I went through that pretty quickly because I want to make sure we have enough time to go over the certification process for anyone who's not familiar and answer any questions that you have at the end. So in terms of certification steps for a new client, someone who has not already been certified to RIOS 2006, isn't worried about transitioning, you're just being certified to RIOS 2016 right off the bat, you'll definitely want to have a copy of the standard. And I included information for the contact person where you can purchase a copy of the standard. Certainly you will then establish your QEH SMS documentation to meet the RIOS standard requirements. You'll perform any training that's needed to meet those requirements. You'll implement any of those requirements that you haven't already implemented, which includes conducting an internal audit, conducting that compliance review to legal and other requirements that we talked about earlier, a review of the system based on inputs from the internal audit, so a management review. You'll also want to have a contract or set up a contract with a certification body like PJR. And you will then need, for that initial certification, you'll need a stage 1 and then a stage 2 audit. We'll talk more about that in a second, but after the stage 2 audit, you will need to address any nonconformities that were identified as a result before a certificate can be issued. So the registration audit, or the registration process, like I said, is made up of a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit. The stage 1 audit is primarily a documentation review to make sure the client or the organization is ready to move forward to stage 2, that the framework, the documented framework, meets the requirement of the standard. And then stage 2 focuses on the actual implementation. So stage 1 is documents, stage 2 is implementation. And it takes place after the stage 1 audit, covering all of the processes, all of the shifts within the organization, within its scope. And this is where you might see nonconformities be identified. We don't issue formal nonconformities at stage 1. We might identify some concerns or areas for you to focus on prior to the stage 2, kind of giving you an indication perhaps of how the stage 2 may go, but nonconformities are not issued until the stage 2 audit. After the stage 2 audit, after you've received your certificate, you start your surveillance cycles, which for most clients are annual surveillance audits, but you can also have them semi-annual, depending on the contract. And that's a partial system audit. So whereas with stage 2 or the recertification audit, which we'll talk about in a minute, where we're covering all of the processes, those surveillance audits are a sampling. We don't necessarily need to cover all of the processes during a surveillance audit, so they're not as long. So you have, if you're annual surveillance, you have 2 surveillance audits. If you're semi-annual, you have 4. And then you have your recertification audit, which if you're on that semi-annual cycle might take place over 2 audits. But in general, the recertification audit is on that 3rd year because the certificates are good for 3 years. And the result will be a new certificate with starting over the 3-year cycle. So at the recertification audit, similar to the stage 2, all the processes would be reviewed. After the package was closed out and any nonconformities identified, you'd get a new certificate, and the cycle would start over, and the following year would be a surveillance audit once again. You don't ever have to complete the stage 1 or stage 2 audit again unless you have your certification revoked at some point or decide to voluntarily terminate your certification and then look to reinstate it in the future. So earlier in the presentation, we talked about how the transition would go for currently certified clients. So that would be on the recertification audit, like we mentioned, or if you were due for a surveillance audit, the surveillance audit would be made into a recertification audit for your transition audit. Okay, so if you haven't already done so, please type your questions into the question field and we'll take a look at that. And in the meantime, I will leave up our contact information here. Nancy Bednarz is the EHS program manager at PJR, and here is her contact information. And once again, I'm Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS assistant program manager, and I have my email address there. And if you're a new client looking to certify for the first time or to transfer from a different certification body to PJR, you can contact our sales department, and I've listed the phone number there. They'd be happy to provide you with a quote or get you started with the process or answer any questions you may have about the general process there. So I'll leave this up while we're answering any questions there may be. Okay, I actually don't see any questions, but I do see someone with a couple of people with their hands raised. If your hand is raised for a question, please type it into the question field. If you see the side panel, you can find the question section there. I will hang on for another couple minutes in case someone is typing. Like I said, I do see some hands raised, but I'm not able to unmute anyone for the purposes of the webinars that we record. So please go ahead and type your questions if you have any, and I will hang on here to answer them. But otherwise, if you're all set and you don't have any questions, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have any other questions, if you think of any later, feel free to contact me by my email address, and I'd be happy to help. Okay, we have some questions now. So one question is, can I share the main differences between the R2 standard and the RIOS 2016 standard? So we can certainly talk about this offline if you want to send me an email or give me a call. It's definitely not the focus of this webinar today. The primary differences, though, between those two standards are the industries that they focus on. The R2 standard is written to electronics recycling, electronic equipment or components containing focus materials such as batteries, mercury, circuit boards, different types of focus materials, whereas the RIOS standard is primarily written for the metal scrap recycling industries. So that's one of the main differences. But certainly if you'd like to talk about the differences in more detail offline, feel free to contact me. And then, let's see, we have another question. Does the recertification audit include an audit of all processes, even if the master file review does not show any previous NCRs? So let's see. So recertification audits cover all processes, yes, regardless of whether there were previous NCRs. That is correct. So on a surveillance audit, we ensure that we sample processes that had an NCR during the previous audit, but for a recertification audit, that's not necessarily relevant which processes had NCRs, since we'll be covering them all. And that is a requirement that's trickled down from requirements that PGR is required to meet, that we cover all of the processes. Similarly, the recertification audit is dictated by the ISRI transition plan for the RIOS 2016 that a client transitioned during a recertification audit. So it's really what processes we cover during a recertification audit don't have anything to do with the master file review, just the nature of the recertification audit. We cover all of the processes. Is there any plan for inclusion in the ISO family? I'm not sure I understand the question. If you're asking about the RIOS standard becoming an ISO standard, I wouldn't have any information about that. I would say not at this time. Where can I get a copy of this presentation? So this presentation, the slides can be accessed through PGR's website, and you can also access a recording through PGR's website. Sometimes you need to submit a request for a copy of the slides, but if you search on PGR's website for past webinars or previous webinars, once it's updated in a day or two, you should see today's webinar as an option. And if after a few days you still don't see it, feel free to contact me and I can follow up, or I can send you a copy. Do PNCRs need to be reviewed for the previous 2 years, even though the recertification audit was done only the last year? Do you go back prior to the recertification audit? Yes, so this is a requirement for RIOS 2016 that we're looking beyond the previous years. So as soon as you start auditing to RIOS 2016, we're looking for 2 years worth of effectiveness of previous NCRs versus one. It doesn't have to do with when the clock doesn't start when you transition and then going forward. So that first audit you conduct to RIOS 2016, we're going to be looking at 2 years worth of previous NCRs. And it's really just for, like I said, the effectiveness, the follow through, and looking for trends in NCRs. That looks like all the questions we have for today. So unless someone's typing right now, feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, my email address or the main PGR number are on the screen, and I'd be glad to answer any other questions you may have. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.